Well, it's usually frontline politicians rather than party apparatchiks who go into print with headline-making memoirs, but Peter Watt, former General Secretary of the Labour Party, does have a story to tell, and it's currently all over the Mail on Sunday, as we just heard. He was the party's most senior official at the time of the Cash for Honours investigation. Well, he survived that, only to become embroiled in a second financial controversy when it emerged that a wealthy businessman, David Abrahams, had given Labour more than £500,000 but channelled it through third parties. No charges were brought. This time Peter Watt had to resign, taking the bullet, he says, for Gordon Brown and other senior figures. Well, he's now accusing the Prime Minister of betrayal, pettiness, chronic indecision and much more. And Peter Watt is with me. Good morning.
Morning.
Is this a sort of bitter book? Is this your revenge?
I heard Kevin say it was a bitter book. You know, I do feel that I was very badly treated, and I think it's almost inevitable that there's going to be a degree of anger in the book. But I think when people actually read it, I think the book actually is it's a very honest book. It's very honest about the mistakes that I made and that others have made. There's an awful lot of very personal anecdotes in there about what was going on in my life as well as what's in politics. And I've tried very hard to avoid it being bitter. But I'm a human being, and I'm sure there's some bitterness in there.
And yet, you know, you're a Labour Party man, or were, and this is coming out just before a general election. It's going to cause a lot of damage, isn't it?
I think it's going to cause a lot of damage. I think there will be, completely understandably, there will be some Labour activists out there, you know, former colleagues and friends who will be understandably quite cross with me. You know, at the end of the day, they're trudging the streets, putting leaflets through doors, and then they read this in the Mail on Sunday. I understand that. But I think the reality is, for me, this was my one opportunity to get my story out, to set the record straight. And I think in terms of the next general election, it's going to have absolutely no impact in terms of the outcome.
Well, let's turn to the story. I suppose the biggest charge against you from the likes of Gordon Brown would be, hold on a second, you were the guy who was in charge of the money raising. You were supposed to be the expert. Did it never occur to you that when this chap, David Abrahams, was funneling such a lot of money through pretty anonymous third parties, it smelt a bit funny?
I inherited this, you know, the David Abrahams relationship with the Labour Party, and I think with hindsight, I think I should have, in a sense, dug a bit deeper. But I think fundamentally, my charge is that, yes, I should have dug a bit deeper and didn't, but that doesn't make me a criminal. And actually what happened was, there was a difficult political story, that there was a political decision was taken to turn it into a much bigger political story by turning me into a scapegoat. And Gordon Brown stood up and accused me of being a criminal. Now, I think under those circumstances, I'm perfectly entitled to say, hang on a minute, after an 18-month police investigation, which at the end of the day said I had committed no offence, as I expected, I'm perfectly entitled, I think, then to say, hang on a minute, let me get my story out.
So you would say, I made mistakes, I should have dug deeper, you know, there was a certain culpability, but I expected loyalty and didn't get it from the Prime Minister.
Fundraising for political parties is enormously difficult, and party staff in all political parties, you know, put themselves on the line in order to make sure that political parties are funded. And the reality, there is a culture in political parties, including myself when I was there, that you play the rules right to the edge. Now, I don't think that's a good thing with hindsight, but that's the reality of it. Playing the rules to the edge, though, does not mean that you break the law. And it was absolutely clear, as far as I was concerned, that no law had been broken. Played the rules right to the edge, certainly, but no law had been broken. And it's a huge charge for the Prime Minister of the country to stand up and say, you've broken the law. That's a pretty big thing to happen. But
you do accept it was wrong, don't you? There was something wrong with the way, I mean, putting the law to one side, something was wrong with the way the money was handed over.
I think absolutely, and in the book I make it absolutely clear that with hindsight, you know, one of my regrets is that I didn't dig deeper. But let me also say as well that, you know, David Abrahams is a massively honourable man, and, you know, he's somebody who, for him, he also was a victim in this. I think he was badly treated as well. And yes, it was wrong because I think it looked wrong. As I think you said yourself, it didn't smell right. But, you know, David Abrahams is an honourable man who wanted to support the Labour Party.
And can you not see from Gordon Brown's point of view, he also inherited all of this, and he was feeling pretty sore about it too? Well,
at the point at which he said what he did, he didn't even have all the facts. So, you know, I don't see how he couldn't actually substantiate the charges he made, if you know what I mean.
One of the most dramatic parts of your account is the transition from Blair to Brown. And after that, that extraordinary period when we thought perhaps there was going to be an election, and you were gearing up this Labour machine, a big Labour machine.
Absolutely.
And then right at the last, well, something made your jaw drop. Familiar to me, of course, but let's just remind ourselves. Prime Minister, let's start with what I suppose is the bleeding obvious. Are you going to call a general election?
I'll not be calling an election, and let me explain why. I have a vision for change in Britain, and I want to show people how in government we're implementing it.
Now, you and lots of other people in the Labour Party were watching that. What were you thinking then?
Well, our jaws did drop. I mean, we were expecting the announcement. Clearly, we'd heard, just in advance that it was going to be called off. But the reality was, we'd spent £1.2 million over the previous 4 to 5 weeks, putting in place all the logistics necessary for a general election that was due to be called the following Monday. So, yes, absolutely, our jaws dropped.
And you had the arrangements, the cars coming to take people off and campaign. Everything was about to be.
It was one of those beautifully ironic moments where, as that interview was being recorded, we literally had a fleet of about 12 cars that were driving around Parliament Square because we were terrified they were going to park up outside Victoria Street and they were due to go off and be used on ministerial visits. We just didn't know what to do with them. Astonishing.
Another astonishing vignette in this is when Gordon Brown took over from Tony Blair. All Blair's people walked out of the office and left it empty, and Brown's people walked in. There was no obvious normal handover as you'd expect.
I think with hindsight, the dysfunctionality of the relationship between Gordon and Tony was so normal to us that actually we didn't even notice it. But actually, with hindsight, the fact that there was a massively experienced team in number 10, which gave virtually no handover to the incoming team, because the incoming team didn't want a handover. So literally, one team walked out the back door, the other team walked in the front door.
It feels crackers. What about the situation now? Because the Labour Party spent very heavily in 2001, very, very heavily in 2005, and they now seem to be close to bankrupt.
Money is clearly very, very tight. Donations from other than the unions appear to have all but dried up. I think the leadership debates are actually going to change the dynamics of the campaign, which I think will be beneficial to the Labour Party in financial terms, because in the past, the leader would have to be on the road the whole time, a massively expensive entourage and massively expensive infrastructure in place.
Do you think that's why Gordon Brown agreed to do them? That it was going to save the party some money?
I'm not sure that was the only reason.
No.
But certainly, if I was planning the finances of the general election, I would be very happy that there were going to be leadership debates, because it would make my life much easier.
Labour will be at a big disadvantage, and one thing that occurs to me is what would happen? Is it possible for a political party, you must know this, to go bankrupt?
It certainly is possible for a political party to go bankrupt. I mean, one of the interesting things about...
sorry, what would happen if that...
Well, the truth is I don't know. When I was there, we looked at that, because there were times it was a very real possibility. I mean, technically, the members of the National Executive Committee are liable for the debts of the Labour Party.
So you went through the process of looking at what would happen if the Labour Party went bankrupt?
We absolutely had to, yeah.
And that will be presumably happening again now?
Well, there is a plan that will, for a much shrunken Labour Party, which we drew up when I was there, which I assume still exists and could be pulled out if needed.
Do you think it's sustainable in the long term that Labour is still so dependent on the unions?
No, absolutely not. Which is why I think that a degree of state funding at some point has to be brought in, because actually, whilst the Labour Party is dependent on the unions, I think it's equally unhealthy to be dependent on high value donations. And I think that we're going to keep this toxic culture of politics and funding. If that's the culture we keep, I think that politics generally will suffer. And I think, although the public would find it very difficult to stomach state funding of political parties, I think there's almost inevitability about it, to be honest.
Peter Watt, out of it now, and probably the happier for that.
Thank
you very much indeed for coming in. When it was announced last year that Keira Knightley would be